All right, how's it going, y'all? So today, we're going to be going over a feature on Synology NAS called Advanced Share Permissions that is going to allow you to specify exactly what files and folders users have access to without just creating a bunch of shared folders. I will say one thing. You want to avoid this if at all possible because it can be very complicated to set up and it's tough to get your mind around and it takes a lot of energy and effort to kind of figure out. So I really only recommend this for kind of businesses who really need it. But it's an important thing to be able to do because it gives you incredibly powerful features on what your users have access to. So you can have folders on the file system that only specific people have access to and not have to have a bunch of shares. And so you have one entire share and then everybody just gets permissions on the subfolders. So funny enough, even in DSM, when you enable this, it says, hey, do not do this at all costs. Not because it doesn't work, but because it's just tough to understand. So first off, what is advanced share permissions? If you're used to Windows systems, it's Windows ACLs, Windows Access Control Lists. And it works identically and actually plugs directly into anytime you've got a Windows file server and you've been using that. You can actually even manage these permissions directly from Windows File Explorer. But I'm going to be showing it on File Station directly on the Synology, so you can easily see it on there. This is also compatible with TrueNAS as well, though TrueNAS does not have the UI to set it up. This is going to allow you to say what users have access to. So if you've ever said, man, I wish my users would not have access to this specific folder in the share, but have access to everything else, we can absolutely do that. A very important thing to do is have a group, and that is going to make your life a lot easier, and we're going to go over that. All right, so the first step is going to go ahead and log into DSM, and we want to make sure we've got groups set up. Groups are going to be a crucial part of keeping this simple and replicable. And so you don't have to, every time you add a user, go into 12 different places. So what I would recommend doing is setting up at minimum 2 groups to start. Don't use any of the 3 defaults that are built in. Instead, create 2 additional groups at minimum for every business. One is going to be employees. So this is going to be your group that has the basic access to the shares. Everybody who is part of the company will have this most basic level of access. This is going to be the common denominator that you want everybody to have access to. And so that way you can just add new users to this employee group and boom, they're already up and running. We're going to go ahead and add our users. So I've got Will. Will is going to be me, and that is going to be the owner company who has extra permissions. And then user 01 is going to be a regular user that we're going to be using to demo all of this. And now we're going to say what they have access to. So we're going to all do this on the folder demo right here, which is going to be used for all of this. So we're going to say, hey, everybody in the company gets at least some access to demo. All the permissions we're going to be talking about here are going to be basically most restrictive. So if you ever see a no access in any part of your groups or anything like that, it is going to lock them down. So what we're going to do is we are going to start by giving everybody basic access to the share and basic access. And then after that, we're going to restrict down specific folders to only specific people. So that's why you almost never want to use the no access, because even if you specifically try to give that user access, anybody who has a no access group, so if they're in a group that has no access to something, will be overridden for everything. So I very rarely would ever recommend using the no access button because it is just so strong. So instead of actually using no access, instead we will just not give them permission. And so that way, if later on a group is added that they have permission to, they would then get that permission. No access is just very restrictive, and so it should be avoided at all costs unless you really know what you're doing. So now, we're going to go ahead and hit next and just run through it. Okay, so we've started up our very basic group for our employees. This is where everybody in the company is going to have this level of access. And so these are going to be your templates, your documents, your basic stuff that you don't want to be restricted at all. Now we want to create one additional group for people who have access to essentially every single folder on the NAS, though this can be restricted as well. But in general, these are going to be exec team or however you want to call it. I'm going to call it exec. These are just 2 great starting points to have easy ability to add people into limited access and super access. You can also customize every single user to every single specific thing you want, but it's just really useful having this basic level of access whenever you've got this, so that way you don't have to add a new person and go through everything and add them. Instead, we've got these basic setups that we've got, and only I'm going to be added into that. I do not need to add in any additional pieces because this group is only going to be used for the advanced share permissions. And so my will user and everybody who is in this exec group is already going to have a read-write access because they're part of the employees group. So this is just an add-on group. So you don't need to do any permissions on this level at all. Basically, that's why you've got your basic level for employees, and that's what everybody has access to. And that's where they're going to get their permission to the share. And then after that, we're going to only use this for giving them specific access to the folders. So that's where you really want to have your base group and then these add-on little groups that people can be added and removed from to give them extra permissions on top of that. So while I could add them to read right here, it would be unnecessary because they've already got those permissions from the other group. And so it's really useful to keep these things simple and not try to really overly complicate them. So you're just going to say, all right, I know everybody who's in the exec group is also going to be in the employees group, so I don't need to do any additional permissions here. And just click through. And we will add one additional one that's just easy to kind of have for a demo, and we're going to call this HR. All right, so I've set up 3 groups that are useful. Exec team will have access to everything. HR is going to be for that HR folder that everybody ends up having. So it's that personal information where anybody in HR will have access to that as well, but not necessarily access to everything. And now we will also have our regular employees group that has the basic access to everything that's not been restricted off of that. Now, every time we add a new user, we can just go into user right here, create, and we'll just create one. So this user will be an HR01. So this is going to be the HR user. So this is where we're going to be able to have that basic HR user who is going to have that extra permission. Now, this is the only screen we need to be modifying on all of our users from now on, because everything else will be automatic based on groups. So for somebody in HR, they're automatically going to be an employee. Everybody you are adding in who's an employee should be part of the employee group. But this person, we're also going to be giving access to the HR folder right there. So now they are in both those groups. And so when we hit next, we're going to see that they are automatically given read-write permissions because they are part of the employees group. And this is just the base level stuff. So that's all we had to do. All we now need to do is assign users to groups, and then everything kind of gets in place from there. So right now we've got 3 users. Myself, that is going to be somebody who's in the super users who has access to the whole file system. This HR user, who will have access to whatever the employees have, plus this HR folder that we're going to create, and our basic user who only has access to the basic folders. So now let's just go into demo and let's just create these folders that we're looking at. And I'm just going to kind of throw together a Office file system here that is pretty common. So you'll have a folder up here that's just for the exec team, just the higher ups get to see this at all, and you don't want anybody else being able to see it. And then maybe there's an HR folder. So we'll give specific permission to those HR users. And now we're going to have like templates, calendar, and maybe archive. So now we've effectively just thrown together a few basic folders here. And this is a common Office file server, except it's probably getting way more complicated than this. So just looking at this, we want to start limiting permissions down to kind of everything. We don't want our regular users to be able to hop into the HR folder and see everything. Same thing for the exec team docs. We want to be able to kind of customize out these permissions and really get these set up exactly how we want them. And so what we need to do now is we need to go ahead and set up advanced share permissions on this. So to that, we go back into the control panel, go into the shared folder, and hit edit on it. Then we're going to come into advanced share permissions. And we're going to see that this should only be used for people who really know what they're doing. Do not enable this unless absolutely necessary. So now we're going to come in here and enable our advanced share permissions. I have not modified any of the permissions yet. So actually when I come into File Station after I hit save on this, I'm not going to see demo at all because we actually have to duplicate our permissions. Your permissions have to be both in the regular permissions, which is under this section right here, and they also have to be under advanced permissions, which is duplicated. So we're going to want to come into this advanced share permissions right here. And the first thing we're going to want to do, we're actually going to start by giving employees access to everything. So we're going to start with a methodology that everybody has access to everything until we restrict it away from them. I'll give a quick demo also on how to do the opposite in a second here. So the first thing we do is we've just said employees have access to everything. So by default, unless we restrict it off, everybody will have access to everything. This is very useful for existing file servers where everybody has already had access to everything. And so it's a very simple thing to set up. And now you can start just chipping away at permissions you don't want people to have. So we're just going to give everybody access to everything, hit save. And now when we go back into File Station, because I am part of employees, Will is part of employees, I now see that I've got access to everything. We can now also start customizing these things down to really say exactly what we'd like. So we're going to right click on it to start and go into properties, and we're going to see this permissions. So we can see that right here, this is the root folder permission. All employees will have read-write access to everything and all of their descendants. So it's going to recursively go down. Everything underneath this, unless something says no, will have access to everything underneath it. So that is a great place to start if you've already had a file system. But now let's come in here and we want to say that our exec team should only be able to be seen by the exec team. So what we're going to do is we are going to start by restricting out those permissions by coming into properties on it, permissions, and what we're actually going to do is we are going to remove the inheritance. So by the basic inheritance, unless we remove it out, everybody will have access to everything. So instead what we want to do is we want to come in here and make inherited permissions explicit. So now we can say, we don't want all employees to have access to everything underneath here. So we're just going to remove employees from it. And now we're going to add the executive team on there. So we're just going to select that executive team. And we're going to say that exec team has access to read and write everything in here. And we're going to apply it to all descendants. So now the exec team will be able to only see this folder, and people who are not on exec team will not be able to see it. So let's go ahead and just see how this is going to look from a user who does not have permission. So I'm just going to mount the share really quick from a user who does not have permission. And so what I just did in here is I went in and I signed in as the regular user, that user 01. User 01 now sees the fact that because he's not on exec team, he does not have access to the exec team docs. But because we have not customized the permission on HR yet, he does have access to that. So we'll go ahead and set that up as well. HR is going to be the same thing. We're going to right click on it, go into our permissions, make them explicit, except now we're going to add two groups in here. Both HR and also the exec team should have access to this. Exec team will always have access. And in this case, so will HR. So both exec team and HR will have the ability to read and write into this. Now, if you wanted to strip away all permissions that had been created in the past, you would hit this button right here, apply to folders and subfolders and files. I would not recommend doing this because it's going to strip away everything you've already done in any folders. But if you just need a giant undo button, you can do that here. So now what's going to happen is both the exec team and HR will have read write into this folder. And so now when we come back over and log in as user 01, we'll see that HR is now also restricted. But now let's say that I get a new job promotion as user 01 and user 01 now needs to be able to access the HR folder. It's simple. All we need to do is come into Control Panel and add that user to the HR group. So I'm just going to come in and give them permission to that group. So now they will have all the permissions of HR. And so now when we pop back in and look at user 01's permissions, we can see that they have access to the HR folder now, but still not the exec team docs. All right, and so that is how advanced share permissions work. I do want to quickly show how it would work if you did the opposite. So what we set up there was we set up where by default, everybody has access to everything unless it's restricted from them. Now we're going to set it up where nobody has access to anything unless you specifically give it to them. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of redo everything on this by coming into File Station and editing the demo folder. And we're actually going to cause this to lose all work we've already done. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify our permissions. So instead of having employees have access to read and write, instead, we're not going to give employees access to read and write from it. Instead, we're only going to give exec team read and write. And so now to actually blow away all the previous work, we're also going to apply this to folders and subfolders. Now that I did that, I'm signed in as user 01 and user 01 is not part of exec team. When they double click on it, they're not going to be able to see anything because they have zero permission to it. All right, so now let's fix that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give the basic employees just the ability to read that one folder and see that it exists. So that way they can go into child folders. So the first thing we needed to do was we gave exec team read write and recursively wiped out everything. So that way any previous permissions we've done have been blown away. Now we want to go ahead and give the employees basic read-only access to only this folder, not the children, not anything else, instead just the one folder. So that way they will be able to see it. So now when we come back in here, we can see that, okay, this user 01 has access to nothing. They can see that these files exist, but they cannot see anything else. And by the way, if you do not want people to be able to see files they don't have access to, you can always come in here under the shared folder settings and hide subfolders and files from users who don't have permissions. So if you did that, they would not be able to see them at all. Here, I like leaving them the ability to see it. Okay, but now we want them to still have access to some things. So now we need to start adding our permissions. So this is that additive permission way. So templates, we're going to say that everybody has access to templates. So we're going to come in here, go into permissions, and we are just going to add an additional permission on top of this to employees. So employees are going to have read and write to everything under here. So they can essentially add and remove templates as required. And so now we'll see that I'm an employee as user 01. And so now I can see all the templates. For HR, what we can do is we can just add the HR group to this. And then the exec team is easy because exec team already we set up access to everything. We're going to just give everybody access to the calendar as well. And finally for archive, what we'll do is we're going to just add read-only permission to employees. So employees can only read the archive, but unless they're given specific permission, they cannot edit the archive. So I just kind of blew through those just as a quick demonstration there. There's a ton you can do when you're looking into these permissions. You can edit really far down where you can have child folders, child files, descendants, recursive, everything. There's a bunch you can mess around with, but we're going to keep this pretty simple, just showing that. I just want to show that it is possible to have a read-only file. So now on the archive, it's going to be read-only. So if I try to add a new folder in here, it's not going to let me because only the exec team can rewrite into it. So now I'm going to promote that user 01 to the exec team by just adding them into that exec team group and hitting save. Now I just need to go ahead and, since I changed groups, I just need to remount the share. So user 01 should now be able to modify the archive. Yep. And that is how these things work. There's a ton of stuff under here, and it can get very complex very quickly. And that's why it's really important to do a good job of making sure you've got great groups. Though you can also give specific permission to specific people. So what we can do is we can say, all right, that user 01, instead of actually putting them in the exec group, I know that they have a specific use case and they're going to be one of the people in charge of managing the backlog and the archive. So we're, instead of giving them exec access, which is everything, we're just going to give them permission to that. And so that is how you set up these permissions. It can be very tough to understand and work with in the beginning. And so you may run into a case where you're like, who has permission to what? Before I leave, I do want to show how you can also kind of start debugging these things by going into the permission inspector. So you can always just come in here and see who has access to what. Okay, HR. HR will have access to read only on this device. But if we come into user 01, because they were given permission, they got everything. If we look at somebody at the exec team was given access to everything. So you can really start figuring out your permissions on all of these things. And it's a useful tool for that. It can be complicated to get set up and running, but once you kind of understand and work with it for a while, it is not too bad and actually is very powerful and very useful. I do also want to mention that if you are on Windows, all of these options here, these advanced share permissions, are also available whenever you're mounting the SMB share. And these permissions do also go to Synology Drive as well. All right, well, that's going to be it for this. If you'd like to hire me for a project for your business or your home use, go ahead and check out the link in the description. And if you have any questions, throw a post on forums.spacerex.co. I'll leave a link to that as well. All right, have a good one. Bye.